G'day, mate. Welcome along to the Exponential Performance Podcast. This is episode 81. And if you're one of our regular listeners, no doubt you have noticed a severe absence on our behalf from regular podcasts. But, geez, Nick, I don't know about you. It feels bloody good to be back in front of the podcast microphone, in the podcast seat, ready to do another one.
It sure does. It's a bit of a rack of the brain to think about the last time we were actually on the camera talking to each other.
Face to face, would have to go back through the archives, but mate, it was lockdown. So not dissimilar time this time last year. So it's been too long. And we sort of had a bit of a hiatus, and we've been thinking and working behind the scenes about where we want to take the podcast and what we want to sort of get out of it, or give you guys, the listeners, what we want to give you to be as helpful as possible, because we don't just want to talk about stuff for the sake of talking about stuff and to fill up the internet with our ramblings just because we have, the podcast that we've developed. And episode 81, we want to do this final push towards episode 100, because it would be nice to get 100 out and beyond that, but make sure that we're delivering something that is of good quality, is of useful information to you. So you'll notice today there's no introduction music. I'm definitely getting rid of that introduction because, one, and this is something that's been an ongoing thing, it only includes my name. And this podcast is by all, and it hasn't just been me for a long time. But Nick, my apologies, mate. We've just never got it changed. And so we are going to get a new intro, or I'm thinking almost just don't even worry about an intro, because, again, it's just fluffy bullshit that's required, and I'd prefer almost we just cut to the chase and just hit it straight in there. But over the next few episodes, we want you, the listener, to help us sort of shape what this podcast means to you. What does the Exponential Performance Podcast mean to you? When you put in your headphones and you push play, what are you expecting to hear? We kind of like the idea that the Exponential Performance Podcast is for the thinking athlete. I hope to think that the people that are listening to this are thinking about their training, thinking about how they're going to get better, and using this information for that. Taking that sports science knowledge, if you will, and applying it to the real world. We don't want to just be talking about stuff just for the pure reason for, the concept of mental masturbation, that you're just talking about stuff and theorizing about stuff just to do that. We want this to be applied and practical. So if you guys can leave some comments, send us some messages about what this podcast actually means to you as one of the listeners, and how you would like to see it shaped moving forward, because at this stage, we've got some frameworks in place around the podcast, but what do you want to see more of is the first thing before we kick into the actual knowledge that we're going to talk about today. And the other thing is we've had a few questions about the Harden Up Project as well, or Harden Up Inc. And if you've been following our social media channels, especially the Harden Up Inc. Instagram, see a little bit more activity on there. And the Harden Up Project is something that is very near and dear to me, and it's a passion project more than anything. Like, I've put quite a lot of resources, quite a lot of money into it, and obviously I haven't made anything from it, and it's not that sort of thing. And I've talked with Nick about what do we do with the Harden Up Project, what do we do about Harden Up Inc., and it's almost like it's not even worth doing anymore because, it doesn't make any money, and I'm probably about $1,500 in debt to the Harden Up Project at the moment, in terms of the T-shirts that I've sent out to people and the stickers and the time and that sort of jazz. And it doesn't really bother me. And I thought I've got to keep the Harden Up Project alive because it does so much. One, it does so much for me. It keeps me so honest. If I'm talking about stuff and posting about stuff, it keeps me driving forward with everything that I'm doing, and it keeps me super honest and accountable. So I really like that. And then I can't let it go because of everything that I've ever done, all the training plans I've written, the training programs, the ebooks, all of that stuff. The Harden Up Project is the thing that I've got the most positive feedback about, that people have taken those concepts and applied them to their real life and got like significant noticeable changes in what they're doing. So for those two reasons, one, to keep me accountable, and to two, keep helping you, Harden Up Project is going to go on, and it's going to scale up from here, and it's going to be bigger and better than it's ever been before, because I need to keep myself accountable at the end of the day. But that's enough from me. Nick, how have you been?
Good, thank you. A lot's happened since lockdown last year. Lockdown in New Zealand. I guess we have to be open to the fact that some of the people listening to this might still be in some sort of lockdown in the UK. And, I feel very, very sorry for those that are. We've had a very good run here in New Zealand, and we've been lucky to be back racing. Had a relatively full summer of events, went around the country. I myself got married late last year as well, so that was good. And yeah, sort of back into some training for myself recently, after having a bit of a break from October. So
excellent.
I'm starting to reapply the principles of Harden Up in the gym and out on the bike.
Excellent. And just day-to-day life in general, isn't it? You can't escape it once you sort of grab the concepts, they just start infiltrating themselves into your day-to-day life, and you cannot avoid them. But more on that. This is not about Harden Up today. We don't have anything for the Harden Up Project for you, but what we do have is a couple of questions that come from our social media around this concept of the 1 week training plan. I always get a message around this, or a variation of this. Someone will post on a YouTube video, can you just write me a training program, please? I don't want anything specific or nothing in depth. Just what would 1 week look like? And I'm just thinking, the YouTube comment section's not really the place for this. And two, I put so much work into my training programs that 1 week almost feels like it's not even worth doing. Do you know what I mean? Because a training program is so much more than 1 week. But what I thought is we need to strip this back and actually think, what does a training program, what are the bones of a training plan or a training program? If we were just to scale everything back to a week, what would that look like as a bit of a template? And then talk about some of the variables around that training program, that 1 week training plan. So, Nick, what are your thoughts around the 1 week training plan? What have you got?
Well, I guess a lot of that comes down to the end goal of the training plan, and probably based on the listeners of this podcast, we should assume that will be some sort of endurance sport, and so therefore the most important thing that I reckon to get in on a weekly basis is that long sort of endurance bike, run, kayak, whatever the sport is, because that's your bread and butter. You get that dialed in, and then you can fit the rest of your sessions around that. Now, for most people, who work Monday to Friday, that will fall on a weekend because we've got the most time in our life to do so. So, you might sandwich a long run, long ride or something on a Saturday. And then I would be factoring into also some sort of what I would term sweet spot or kind of tempo-y session. And that's at around about that kind of 91% of your threshold heart rate, sort of mid-top zone 3. And that's going to give you the best bang for your buck in terms of sort of interval type of training to really sort of jazz up the aerobic system and couple that with your endurance session.
So if you only had 2 sessions that you could do, a long steady state aerobic type session, your traditional long slow distance, and then some sort of sweet spot work in there as well.
Yep, that would be my 2. if someone's like, I've got limited time, or if you could do those 2 sessions every week, week in, week out for 52 weeks of the year, you're going to be a much better athlete because of it than yo-yoing all over the show.
What if you had a third one in there? Because we all know that people usually train more than twice a week. What would you have?
Oh, and, we were talking about this earlier. I would throw in some sort of strength session, and that could vary from sort of a body-weighted kind of core circuit or session through to actually doing some sort of lifting, strength conditioning in a gym setting. And that would be, kind of covering the strength and that kind of core component, as well as you've got your aerobic conditioning going on as well outside of that.
Nice. And then if they had a fourth session, so we've got those gym sessions in there, we've got our long one, we've got our sweet spot. What else?
Yeah, so I'd go 2 strength sessions just to be, err on the side of caution. So we go to another session again, probably looking at some sort of thresholdy type of work, those sort of zone 4 intervals where you're looking to build some lactate and let the body handle that load. And I believe we will cover some more of that kind of conversation later on. But certainly a threshold session would be my next go-to for endurance sport.
Yeah, and if you get that in there, even just the long one, the sweet spot, or potentially a hill session in there, which usually turns into a sweet spot often, depending on what the hills are, and your gym sessions, if you can do those, you're probably 90% of the way there. And then if you add that threshold interval type session on as well, like that's a pretty good training plan, isn't it? Like just a good structure to base things around.
Yep, it is. I mean, you're obviously not worrying a heap about a linear progression around when you're looking at what can I do on a week-to-week basis. And again, a lot of people that I see or talk to don't have the time in their life to completely dedicate to a perfect periodization for an event. So having a week that they can mold and, maybe just raise the durations a couple of hours across the course of 3 or 4 weeks and then back it off and raise it again within those longer sessions. It's a really, really neat looking picture for a training week.
Nice. And I guess that it ties into really nicely into another question that I had and I thought would sandwich these two together because it kind of flows onto this. Once we've got that basic framework of what does the ideal training week look like, then we can go from there. And that this question is asking, how can an athlete adapt to their training if they're always doing the same amount of training per week? So let's say, here's an example that they give. For example, if somebody trains each week for 15 hours and that's the amount of time that they have, 15 hours per week, and they just do the same thing every week, there's no easy week, there's no changes of their intensity. How is a person able to change their training and continue to adapt and to recover and improve if they're training the same amount every week? So I thought, well, this is kind of nice because we've set up the perfect framework for a week of training, and let's assume that's just the same every single week from now forever. That person is eventually going to adapt to that training stimulus if it's the same. So how can we change things if time is fixed? How can we change things if time is fixed? And I think the first thing to think about is that time is only one metric, and it's a really easy one to measure because you start your stopwatch, you go out and do your session, you come home and you stop it, and that measures time. So it's really easy, and we often associate endurance sport, at least, and potentially quite correctly, that more is better up to a point, of course. And after that point, more doesn't necessarily become better, but we can just progressively overload ourselves by doing more. So once we run out of that more, how can we then continue to adapt? So let's imagine 15 hours, or even scale that back 10 hours. 10 hours a week is all we've got. How can we then keep progressing? What are your thoughts around that, Nick?
Well, if someone came to me and said they had 10 hours a week to dedicate to their training, I would be trying to encourage that to be the first week might only be 8 hours. So take 2 of those hours and get in some extra mobility, some extra recovery time. Second week would be a sort of a 10-hour looking at that, maybe rising that intensity in some of those sort of tempo threshold sessions. And then the third week being a bit of a longer week in terms of endurance, so slowing down the intensity but raising the time out there per session as well, to kind of change the mode within that from a intensity versus duration. Obviously keeping the duration the same, but you're raising the overall intensity of the session, which raises therefore the overall loading of that week, and then raising the loading again in a different platform through the endurance side. This is the third week down the track.
Yeah, and I guess what are you going to lead to with the fourth week? I've got a feeling I know what it is.
Wow. If we were being true to colour, probably a recovery week.
Yeah. So what you're saying is you need some progression within the program and then some recovery. Because what this person says in their email is they don't have a recovery week. There's no recovery weeks. It's just the same thing, bang, 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 bang. And what you'd probably think is that person gets very stale or burnt out or has an injury and then is forced to take that recovery. So keeping in mind that, yeah, planned recovery is better than enforced recovery at the end of the day, if you can avoid that. And I like the intensity thing, because intensity, or how hard you're training, is one that often goes out the window first because we just go for time. But with intensity, you can have the same time, but you can have a different result, which is ideal in this scenario. It's like that old saying that doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome is the definition of insanity. So if we're doing the same thing every week and we're expecting to improve, well, it's just insane, because you're not going to improve. You're going to adapt to that exercise stimulus, and then it's not going to go any further. So we need to change something. And intensity is a great place to start first. There's a couple of other areas that I thought we could adjust but still keep the time the same was resistance. So increasing the resistance, whether that be running and riding up hills or doing bigger gear efforts on the bike, using bungees around kayak hulls, or using pool buoys or paddles for swimming. All of those things, you can train for the same amount of time, but you're getting a very different load. You're getting more neuromuscular load in there because of that increased resistance. We talked briefly around strength work. I mean, the progressions that you can get in the gym are just phenomenal in terms of the same amount of time. You can change the training stimulus in the gym in 1,000 different ways in the same amount of time to continue to get results. And for endurance athletes, especially, we've talked about it before, if you're over the age of 30, gym training should be, highly recommended, I think. If you're over the age of 40, should be compulsory. Like, it should be a compulsory thing that somebody makes you do. So there's a lot of gains to be made for endurance athletes by getting some strength work in. And again, not changing the training time at all. You would get better results by dropping some of your training out in the real world, running, biking, kayaking, swimming, and supplementing it, or replacing it with some strength work. And then one other area that I thought, Nick, that we could potentially look at as well was nutrition. So you're training for the same time every week, but how can you manipulate your nutrition around that to keep getting gains? So I thought, taking away some nutrition, having those nutrient deprivation sessions to improve that metabolic efficiency. Same amount of time, different training stress, you're going to continue to see results there. So I think the key thing to keep in mind here is that you need to expose your body to a different training stimulus. And even if you've got the same amount of time every week, you can do that by all of those different things that we just talked about: intensity, resistance, neuromuscular stimulus through strength work, and adjust your nutrition, either withholding it or giving it at the appropriate times to maximize your adaptations.
Yep, absolutely. And also, I'd offer a wee challenge to anyone that thinks they've got a set number of hours per week. maybe you go 8 hours one week, 10 hours the following week, 12 hours, and then the next week after that you might be in your recovery week and you do 6 hours. And so you've banked some time in that recovery week where you might catch up on some things that are taking up time in the previous week, so you can actually do your 12 hours of training. And that's not going to work for everybody, but you can give a few hours back and then put it into another week somewhere else.
Yeah, excellent. So I guess this is kind of came full circle of what does this ideal week of training look like? And I think it's important to keep in mind that there is no ideal cookie cutter training week. Although if you had a long session, a sweet spot or a hill session, a gym session and an interval session, that's going to be the basic bread and butter of any endurance program. But then around that, how we manipulate those other variables in terms of intensity and resistance and nutrition, they have a massive impact on just the load itself. And even if the hours don't change, you could do 10 hours every week and it not look any different if you were just looking at time. But you could make those weeks look very, very different in terms of your intensity. I mean, you can have a 10-hour recovery week and a 10-hour load week. And people say, well, how is that a recovery week if it's 10 hours and your load week was 10 hours? Well, the intensity is just completely different. You spend a lot of that time doing technique work or corrective exercises in the gym or, insert any other option here. And it was a completely different training load. So time, don't get hung up on time because it's not the be-all and end-all.
No. And I'd say that the best training week is the one that you can be consistent with again and again and again and again. No one likes no one that can do a 30-hour week 1 week and then 10 weeks at 2 hours is actually going to get very far in their performance. But someone that could do 6 hours every week for 10 weeks is going to be a much better athlete.
Big time. Consistency.
Yeah. It is one of your
talked about it before.
favorite terms.
Excellent. Consistency. All right, team, we're going to move on to our next question, which, again, is multiple questions around the same concept that we always get. And I thought that we've already answered this. Like, I'm 100% sure we've already talked about this. But either one, we haven't done a good enough job of doing it, which is quite highly possible, or two, people just haven't listened to it. So we're going to give it another crack. But it's around VO2 max and anaerobic threshold. So here is, I'm just going to read these. These come from, I think, YouTube and Instagram messages. So it said, hey guys, I've just watched one of your videos on YouTube and found it extremely interesting. I was just wonder if you could answer me this question as I'm having a bit of trouble understanding it. Describe the relationship between anaerobic threshold and VO2 max. And then here's another question directly around that as well. Says, I don't really understand why anaerobic threshold is always shown to be lower than VO2 max. Since our oxygen usage will always be difficult, since the oxygen usage will increase with the difficulty to a certain point where oxygen becomes constrained, aka VO2 max. Shouldn't the anaerobic threshold be higher than VO2 max? And then there's one more, and this came off some forum that I was looking through, and I saw this, and I was just like, this person has no idea. And they're giving out this advice. This person must be going into a race this weekend, and it said, good luck. It's all about breathing in through the nose, out through the mouth to find that limit of VO2 max, where you'll be on the edge of aerobic operating and peaking, but not cross into anaerobic. And so between all of those three questions, I just want to have a talk about anaerobic threshold, VO2 max, how they relate to each other, and what's going on. So Nick, kick us off on this one. Where are we at?
Well, I often forget that the term anaerobic threshold exists where it does, because I'm so used to calling it lactate threshold. And I don't quite know where in the sort of the mainstream sort of media and around sports science it's switched to being anaerobic threshold as the kind of the key term. Because lactate threshold and VO2 max, I think, describe the picture a lot better. And I mean, you've done a few whiteboard Wednesday sessions that people could go back and check out, which actually explain this concept really well. But the concept of lactate threshold in terms of where it fits into VO2 max, the VO2 max for the common athlete is a very hard number to gauge. We're never going to know it unless we go and do some sports science testing. And it doesn't have a huge correlation to our performance on race day compared to lactate threshold.
Absolutely. That's a big part of it, isn't it? And I guess the VO2, like you can have a really low VO2 max if you got the number measured, and your anaerobic threshold or your lactate threshold or your onset of blood lactate accumulation or whatever we're going to term this point where the body starts producing more energy anaerobically, can be really high, and you can have a better performance than someone with a high VO2 max. So yeah, there's definitely that. There's not a correlation between the two, I guess you could say. But I think, like, if we just define VO2 max, it's the maximal rate that our body can take in and use oxygen. And so that doesn't happen in a purely aerobic state. And I think people get confused about that. They think VO2 max or your maximal aerobic capacity happens before your anaerobic threshold, but it's around the other way. So your anaerobic threshold or your lactate threshold isn't actually about transitioning to 100% anaerobic. And I think that's what people think. You're not going 100% anaerobic after your anaerobic threshold. Your anaerobic threshold or your lactate threshold is simply where your body starts to use more anaerobic energy. So you start to use that glycolytic energy system more. So there's more lactate in your blood. Before that point, your lactate levels in your blood were really low just because you're working more predominantly aerobically. And so I think what people think is, well, I crossed over the anaerobic threshold. I must be 100% anaerobic now, and there's no energy coming aerobically. But that's simply not true, because what your aerobic energy system continues to do is continues to ramp up as well, but your anaerobic energy system's ramping up at the same time. And I like that analogy that we talked about in previous podcasts of those 3 pots boiling on the stove, our 3 different energy systems. And it's not actually until our aerobic energy system gets to a full boil at VO2 max, which actually happens a long time after you actually start turning up your anaerobic energy system. But our anaerobic energy system doesn't fully tap out until after VO2 max. So we're sort of starting to turn the dial, and that's lactate threshold. It's like, we're starting to put a little bit more gas into that pot. We're still ramping up the aerobic capacity. That pot hits a full boil. It's going as hard as it can, but the anaerobic energy system is still just simmering away. Once we go past our VO2 max, there's no more capacity in our aerobic system anymore. That's fully tapped out. Now we're really going to have to crank the gas up on the anaerobic energy system, and we're going to get that pot boiling. But that happens after your VO2 max, when you're sprinting along. Makes sense? Or have I completely lost everyone?
No, I think the pot analogy is a good one, and we might need to link back to what episode that was in the show notes if you don't have it there.
No, I don't have that exactly what it's going to be, but if you check out the YouTube channel, our YouTube channel, there's a bunch of different videos on there about energy systems, and I am just about to pop out a whole bunch of videos that break down the zone series that we did. So zone 1, zone 2, zone 3, zone 4, zone 5, all in their separate videos, so you don't have to go trawling through the podcast episodes. So the best place to see those is over at the Exponential Performance YouTube channel.
Perfect.
Anything else to add around VO2 max, anaerobic threshold, and how they sit within each other?
Only maybe just to briefly touch on the different methods of training them. And I think that can sometimes help explain what they actually, or where they sit within relation to each other. And again, your Whiteboard Wednesday session does a good job, but with your VO2 max sessions, you're looking to fully maximize or max out the aerobic system with a minute or 2 minute, let's say, effort, and then you're looking to fully recover with a minute, so 1-to-1 work to rest ratio, versus training for the lactate or the anaerobic threshold. You're looking to build up a high level of lactate in the body to enable the body to handle that and process that and get better and more efficient at doing that. So you might do a 4-minute interval and a 2-minute recovery, and then you go again. So you're working hard and recovering short, working hard again to force the body into processing that lactate, but you're not fully maxing the aerobic system. So an anaerobic threshold interval for an endurance athlete is unlikely going to be under that kind of 3 to 4 minute time frame, because it needs time for the heart rate to come up and the energy systems to start to produce the lactate that we're trying to accumulate in the system, essentially. And I will often try where I can to get athletes to do VO2 max sessions using power on the bike or pace when they're running, because the heart rate never fully gets up into the zone within that minute or 2 minutes sometimes. So if you've got a pace that you know that, okay, right, at this many minutes per kilometre or this wattage, I am working in my VO2 max states in that kind of zone 5 area, then you can actually get the most out of that session without thinking, oh, my heart rate's still in zone 4, I need to work harder again. And then you're actually working on your anaerobic power or that sort of very top end system.
Absolutely. And I just want to touch on that last the last little comment, or the last little question that was, well, it was that comment that someone left, and just how that's not correct, because some people think, well, it kind of sounded like it was probably correct because they threw a couple of big words in there, and it seems like it would be logical. But let's have a think about this. So this person is giving advice around pacing on race day. So in through the nose, out through the mouth. Cool. Probably a great way to breathe for sure, especially when you're at steady state. I'd always say don't try and control your breathing too much when you're exercising, because your body does it quite automatically. But in through the nose, out through the mouth is a good way to keep you nice and steady, because if you're breathing like that, you can't go too hard. So if you're doing a long endurance race and you're still nose breathing, you're going to keep your pace down just as a result of breathing through your nose, because you'll naturally transition to breathing through the mouth as you push harder. But that's a bit of a side note. But then it says to find the limit of VO2 max, the limit of VO2 max. So there is the limit of VO2 max is VO2 max. And so you're never going to be able to sustain VO2 max in an endurance race any longer than a few minutes, because it's your maximal rate of oxygen consumption. So what they're talking about there is find your limit of aerobic operation, which is your lactate threshold. So they're talking about something that's up here, but what we're actually talking about is something that's down here, and it's called your lactate or anaerobic threshold. And that's that point where your aerobic system is doing the majority of the work. And if you go over that point, then you're going to start producing more energy anaerobically, and you're going to produce more lactate. Your body's not able to process that, so you start developing fatigue. But that is a long way below your maximal oxygen consumption. Your body can consume a lot more oxygen than that, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it should, or that it's going to help your performance when you're thinking about pacing. Pacing is kind of like a hose or emptying a bucket of water. So you can punch a massive hole in a bucket of water and it's all just going to flow out within 2 seconds. That's the maximal rate that water can come out of that bucket. That's the maximal rate that your body can consume and utilize oxygen. Happens really fast. The capacity, though, is the size of the bucket. If you empty that bucket in 2 seconds, then there's no more water in there. However, if you fill that bucket up with water and then just poke a couple of pinholes in there, then it's going to start flowing out really slowly. And there's going to be a point where you're going to get the longest amount of water coming out of that bucket for the most amount for the longest time. So the most amount for the longest time is your lactate threshold. That's where it's just consistently coming out, and it's going to be able to do that for hours at a time without running out of water. But if you compare that to just cutting a big hole in the bottom of the bucket, all the water's going to rush out. It's powerful. It happens very quickly. Can't do it for a long time. So I guess that's another way of thinking about that. VO2 max, lactate threshold, anaerobic threshold, depending on what term they are using. That's enough talk about lactate thresholds and anaerobic thresholds, do you think, Nick?
Yep, I think so too.
Brilliant. So we're going to wrap it up there. First episode back in a long time. And like I said, we've got some good stuff planned. But if you have any feedback, things you'd like to see, people you'd like to hear from, and let us know, what does the Exponential Performance podcast sort of mean to you? When you put those headphones in, what are you expecting to hear? Are you expecting to hear absolute dribble about random stuff, or are you thinking you're going to get some sciencey stuff that you can apply to the real world? Are you, whatever it might be, what do you want? Let us know. We're going to do our best to bring it to you. However, until next time, get out there and train hard, but most importantly, train smart. We'll talk to you later.